Next up, principles of design. So we've just taken a look at our elements of art. Reminder, that's our building blocks of design. And it's time now to just dig into what are the principles of design. And we were talking about how the elements are like our toolkit. Our principles are those strategies for putting them to work. This is how we organize and arrange the elements on our page. This is how we create our cohesive, effective, and visually unified designs. And remember, unity is one of the goals. All right, so what are our principles of design? We have balance, contrast, emphasis, movement, pattern, rhythm, proportion and scale, unity, and harmony. And just like the last section, we are going to go by one with this. First up is balance. And balance is all about the distribution of visual weight within a design. And when these elements that we have on our page are balanced, the composition feels stable and it also feels harmonious or unified, as we just had discussed. When they're not, the design feels a little bit off or wonky or unfinished. And as designers, it's our job to decide what type of balance best fits the purpose of the work at hand. So what types of balance are there? We have symmetrical, asymmetrical, and radial. Symmetrical and asymmetrical are the ones that you're going to probably see the most. Radial is more situational based, and you're not going to see that as often. We discussed in the elements the concept of static versus dynamic design. And symmetrical and asymmetrical is going to fall into these two categories, where symmetrical is more static and asymmetrical is going to be more dynamic when it comes to our design approach. Symmetrical, if you were to cut it in half, it's going to be a mirror image. Asymmetrical, if you were to cut it in half, it would not be a mirror image. And each one has a different type of energy that it lends to the piece. So with symmetrical balance, again, cut it on either side of a central axis, it's going to be a mirror image of itself. It's really classic, it's formal, it's reliable. It's great for things like wedding invites or magazine layouts. But like with all things, too much can be too much. So if you have a little bit too much of a symmetrical balance, it might feel a little bit stiff or predictable. With asymmetrical, the visual weight is still balanced, but the elements are not mirrored. So you're probably going to achieve balance through something like size, color, positioning. It's a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more modern, and it's going to feel more natural to the viewer. For this example, we have this website layout. It has that large image on one side and the text blocks are on the other, sort of scattered throughout the page. It creates that sort of dynamic visual interest for the viewer. It keeps them busy and looking throughout the page to see what's going on. Radial. This one radiates out from a center point, sort of like a mandala or the spokes of a wheel. It is less common, but it can be very effective for designs that need to draw attention to a central focal point, just like this one. And it has a really nice decorative aspect to it, too. So, why does balance matter? And it's just simple. Balance is going to be one of those things that help us to create structure. It is ensuring that your design doesn't feel lopsided or overwhelming. And it's also going to help the viewer's eye move through the composition naturally. Without balance, you're going to risk losing some clarity, focus, engagement, and organization. So when you're designing, just ask yourself this: what is the focal point of the design? So when you have it, you're going to arrange the elements in a way that's going to make your piece feel visually stable. Symmetrical might make more sense if you're working on something more formal, but if you're working on something that needs to be sort of fresh and edgy, the asymmetrical will probably work better. Radial balance, this is for when, like we said, the center, that focal point, is going to be the star of your composition. Next up, we have our friend contrast. And this is one of the more powerful tools because it's going to grab our attention. It's going to create visual interest within our design. And contrast is all about the differences: light versus dark, big versus small, bold versus subtle, color versus black and white. You know, anything that's going to have a sort of 0 to 100 balance between the two, that's going to be our friend contrast. And it's going to be that which makes, design more dynamic, and it's going to help important elements stand out. So in design, contrast happens when there are two or more elements that are noticeably different, like in this book cover design that I have here in our illustration. In this case, The difference could be size, color, texture, shape, or even type. And we have two of those things working here. We have our color, and then we have a little bit of a shift in our type. And the red is going to sort of force our eye into the middle of the pane, and then we can sort of flow around the composition from there. And contrast isn't about making things look dramatic. It's about helping to create and reinforce the visual hierarchy, and it's also helping to guide the viewer's eye to what matters most on the page. Color contrast, like this one. This is probably the most common type of contrast. Think of, and this is the example that I actually used on the slide for contrast, dark background, light text, complementary colors. High color contrast ensures readability and visual impact. Size. So with size contrast, it's going to help create that sense of hierarchy. The larger elements on the page are going to draw your attention in first, while the smaller elements are going to take that supporting role, just like what we were saying with color. One of the colors needs to have the main stage, and the others are just going to be the supporting cast. And this is great for headlines versus whatever's happening in the body text. Or in this case, the giant, large illustration, and at the bottom, the really small type that sort of feeds you into the rest of that info. That diagonal line of the illustration is moving down in such a way that it makes us go into the type, and then we just start back in, and we just create this sort of natural loop within the composition, thanks to our friend contrast. Value. So we can also have contrast, of course, in value, and this is the lightness or darkness of a color, as we already discussed. We have our high value contrast, like Strong's blacks or white, like here in Beirut Saks Fifth Avenue bags. This is going to be nice because it creates really striking visuals that are going to stand out, just like this example. Low value contrast is going to feel a little bit softer, but it can risk being hard to read if it's overused. Shape or style contrast. When we mix different shapes or styles, it's going to help create that visual interest that we're looking for in our compositions. So Jessica Hische and her book series is really great for this because, you're often going to see that bold sans serif font with a nice script. Or in this case, the back cover, we have like a traditional serif, so it feels more air quote like a book, but you're still getting this really strong contrast between the two. It's going to add extra variety, and it's also going to help each element on the page stand out. So why is contrast actually important? This isn't just about the aesthetics, it's about the communication of the piece. We want to establish the hierarchy of the page. We want to make sure the viewer knows where to start and how to keep them flowing throughout the page. It's also going to add energy and variety to the composition, and it's going to help keep your design from feeling flat or monotonous. Emphasis. All right, we've talked about balance, we've talked about contrast, and now it's time for emphasis. And we've sort of skirted around this whenever we've been talking about the focal point. And this is essentially what this is. It's our focal point. It's what the viewer, on the page, it's like, hello, here I am. This is important. Start here. So the emphasis is giving the viewer the first thing that they're going to look at on the page, and then it's going to help them move to the other elements on the page. And at its core, it just means making one element stand out more than the others. This might be a headline, an image, a call to action button, whatever it is. We're going to ensure that the viewer knows exactly where to start on the page and then what the main message is. So the bold headlines that are often used in design, this is immediately going to draw our attention to it because it's larger and it's more prominent than the other text on the page. Maybe you're into UI, UX, or web, and that brightly colored button is going to grab the viewer's eye and encourage some sort of action or response from them. Without emphasis, the design has a potential to feel really scattered, and the message that you're trying to communicate could get lost. So there are several ways to create emphasis in your design, and one of those is going to be our size. A classic version of this is our traditional newspaper page with our headlines. Our headlines is that one element that's a little bit larger, as well as the images here. But our headline is going to grab our attention. We're going to read that first. Then we're going to go to the subheadline. Then we're going to flow into the article itself. That is a perfect example of visual hierarchy of a page because you know exactly where to start and then how to flow through it just because we have that focal point. We have that emphasis that we're looking for. We can also use color. So if you're using a bold or contrasting color, like in these examples, it's predominantly black, white, grayscale, but we have that pop of orange that stands out. And that's going to draw attention to specific elements or elements on the page. So maybe that orange or red call to action button on a neutral background. This is a really classic example of this because you're going to have no choice but, to look at it and do some sort of action, like buy now, click here, start here, sign up today. Color is a really effective device for this. As well, we have our placements. The positioning or the placement of the element on the page, whether it be dead center in this case, it has some sort of prominent location to start the viewer's journey on the page. If it's dead center like this, it has a potential to, get the viewer to look at it and then, go up to the info, flow around, see what's happening. It's going to be this theater at this time, etc. So you get that sort of hierarchical flow from however it is placed on the page. I will say it's one of those things that come with a warning as well. Something that's dead center on the page does also have a potential to stall out compositionally. So it's one of those things you have to pay close attention to whenever you're working with this style of composition and placement. As well, we have isolation. So when you separate an element from the rest of the design, it's going to give it, by default, extra importance. So that negative space that we've been talking about, negative space around a focal point is going to make it feel really distinct from the rest of the elements. Like this one, we're seeing the title. We have a lot of air around it at the top. We know when, then it flows into the where, the when, and the why. So we have a really nice page design when we have things isolated from others. As well, we have our contrast. So maybe it's bold type with lighter elements, and it's going to help make that focal point even more impactful. It's almost like you're going to have no choice but to look at whatever it is the designer wants you to look at. All right, so why does emphasis matter? And it's quite simple. I mean, without it, your design could feel really overwhelming or confusing. And Timothy Goodman's piece, I think, is a good example for this because he has a really distinct illustrative style, but he also knows how to use those focal points. And he, uses them in the way that you know where to look first, and then you can interact with the rest of the space. You get the info, and then you can have a sort of quieter time with the piece to see all of his details. So again, you're creating that clear starting place for the viewer, and you're going to make sure that your message gets across quickly and effectively. And so when you're designing, you got to think about that hierarchy of info. What's the most important message? Is it a headline? Is it the product? Is it a photo? Is it some sort of call to action? You're going to then use the emphasis to make sure that that element is going to stand out and that the structure of the rest of the page is going to be the supporter of that. Movement. So we've been talking about, moving our viewer's eye through the page, and this is literal movement. So how do we get the viewer to look to point A to B to C? And it's not just about the motion, it's that path that's going to lead the viewer to the most important parts of your work step by step. Movement and design is going to take your eye from one element to the next. So we were just talking about our focal point. That's helping to set that stage. And then the movement is going to be the thing that takes you through the rest of the info. So it's like that map that tells you where to start, where to look next, and then how to navigate the design in general. And without this sort of flow or movement, the design can feel really static or maybe even confusing. But with it, you're going to create a really nice sense of direction, energy, and you're going to be able to communicate your message appropriately. So how do you create movement? You're going to use lines, you could use paths, you can use repetition of some sort, you can use the directionality we talked about in lines, like, the powerful use of the arrow when you're using it right. It is going to create that sense of direction, and hopefully it's towards the composition and not away from the composition. And as well, you're going to create movement through our friend hierarchy. movement controls the journey. If it's designed well, the viewer is going to stay engaged, and it's going to also ensure that they're going to get all the info that you're trying to impart to them. So maybe it's a call to action, maybe it's some sort of narrative. This is going to make the design a more effective and enjoyable experience. So when you're designing, you want to think about the path that you want your viewer to take. Where should they start? Where should they go next? Where should they go next? And where should they end? Does it just end? Should it loop back in? Etc. These are all decisions that you have to make whenever you're in that creation and crafting stage. You can use those lines, the repetition, the hierarchy to guide the eye, and you also ensure that the flow is going to feel natural and intuitive. Pattern is so much fun within the design and principle world because it's going to help to create some sort of consistency and visual interest in your design. That's all about the repetition. So it could be repeated use of elements, type, shapes, lines, colors. There's going to be some sort of rhythm structure to it that's going to make it feel unified. It can be really bold. So it could be like a repeat pattern on fabric. It could be a product with some sort of shape that keeps echoing on the background. Or same thing with, on a website, maybe it has a color pattern to it. And these patterns are going to help reinforce your message. They're going to help set a tone and quite possibly and hopefully establish some sort of brand recognition. And they're not just decorative. They're functional tools that are also going to help create consistency across all of your designs, especially, if you're working with a brand or a brand identity product. You want everything to feel like it belongs together, and the patterns that you're using, whether it be type, color, an actual repeat pattern, are going to be that which creates that consistency. So in branding, like we just said, that repeated logo pattern is going to create some sort of cohesive identity. If you're someone who works in textiles, it could be like stripes or florals. This could be, showing what it's like to show some sort of personality or style. Web design, there could be subtle patterns that's going to add depth and sophistication, and it's not going to distract from the content. All of these are going to be unique and vary, but they're all going to reinforce, your design and whatever message you're trying to get out with your design. Like the others, we have different types. So we have geometric patterns, organic patterns, abstract patterns, and the repeating motif, which you might have learned about if you took history courses. All of these are effective devices for patterns and pattern making in design. And why are they important? Well, they're going to help us create recognition and cohesion. Patterns are going to help tie multiple elements together, and it's going to make the design feel that is more intentional, more polished. They might also enhance the user experience because they're going to provide that visual consistency. So maybe it's across a product line, a website, or campaign. They all feel like they belong together. So when you're designing, think about how the patterns can reinforce your message. Are you creating that as a brand identity? That subtle pattern might be able to unify all your materials across whatever product or type it is that you're working on. Same thing, maybe it ties into the package design. Maybe that bold repeat pattern is going to make the product stand out on the shelf and appeal to the consumer. The key, it's to ensure that the pattern enhances the design without overpowering it. Rhythm. This does tie in a little bit with pattern and movement because it's sort of this almost a musical marker, but in a visual way. We're trying to, take repetition, but build it up a little bit further. And we're creating that sense of flow and movement through repeated elements, which in turn are going to help guide the viewer's eye and give your design energy. So in design, rhythm is like I just said, it's like music, it's creating this beat or the tempo between shapes, lines, colors, images, symbols. So just like in music, it's going to be maybe steady or predictable, or maybe it's going to be dynamic or varied. And it's just going to depend on whatever mood it is that you want to create. So let's just take a look at these examples. The consistent grid layout creates a steady rhythm. This one here on the left. This is going to be perfect for a professional or structured design. The Swiss minimalists are a great place to start whenever you're researching this aspect of it. The middle one, that flowing design with curves, it's going to feel a little bit more natural and dynamic. But on the far right with Aaron Draplin, the bold pattern that varies in size, this is going to add energy and unpredictability, which is going to help draw that viewer in. Especially with this, you get like the color shift, you have some neutrals in the middle, and then it flows into that rainbow pattern. So we might not be expecting the grayscale, especially when it's surrounded by such bright, vibrant colors. We have regular rhythm. This is really steady. It's predictable, where the elements repeat in equal intervals. And that's the one here on the left. This is akin to the grid layout. It's very stable, it's very orderly, and it's very organized. Alternating is a pattern that's going to switch back and forth between two or more elements, sort of like if you're alternating text and images in a magazine spread. It's still structured, but you're going to get a little bit of variety within it. The flowing rhythm is one that imitates or mimics natural movement. It's going to use curves or waves to create some sort of sense of motion and energy. And this is often used in designs that you may want it to feel a little bit more organic, a little bit more dynamic. The progressive is going to be a rhythm change that's going to visually change gradually. So maybe they're going to increase in size or shift in color. It's going to create this sort of sense of movement or evolution, and it's perfect for designs that show, progression or that tell some sort of story. Why does rhythm matter? Because we want to keep the viewer engaged. And this rhythm is going to add the structure to your design, and it's going to ensure that the eye moves naturally from one element to the next. And it also creates visual interest and energy. And this is going to make your work feel a little bit more alive and more intentional, because we're trying to create something like we've been talking about that communicates XYZ, so there is intentionality behind it. Proportion and scale, these two principles were sort of bumping together because there are common grounds between the two, and these revolve around size and how it impacts your design. And they are closely related, but they are going to serve a unique purpose. Proportion is about the size relationship between the elements within a design, whereas scale is the size of an element relative to its environment or overall composition. The proportion. This is going to ensure that different elements work well together, and it's also going to help maintain balance and harmony. But scale, on the other hand, is going to help to create emphasis, that hierarchy, the drama, just by playing with the size on the page. And together, these are going to allow you to control how a design feels and also how the viewers interact with it. So, it's breaking this down. Proportion, like we said, it's just making sure that the elements of your design have a logical size relationship. So let's say with typography, the headlines should be larger than the body text, but the difference shouldn't be so extreme that it feels disconnected. So you can make them pretty large, but if they get to that stage where too much is too much, then you need to, dial it back just a little bit. Imagery. So in a design, the proportions of the imagery should feel balanced with the surrounding elements, such as the type that's around it, the shapes, or other visuals that you've been using. So in this case, a large central image could serve as that focal point, but the smaller supporting images create context without overwhelming the composition. So in this case, the word retro is echoing the sort of cloud photo without being, the star. It's like part one of the hierarchy is the image, and then 2 is the title itself, and 3 the info from there. Shapes and elements. So proportion within a logo, like the size of text relative to the icon, these should feel balanced and intentional. We want them to feel like they fit together. And I talk about, something in design feeling like it's anchored on the page, like it couldn't be anything else proportion wise. And logos, especially when they have something like this, it's a symbol plus the typography, they need to have that balance to them so it feels right. Emphasis, the scaled up headline or image is going to become the focal point, and you're instantly going to have the attention drawn to it. As well, contrast. So when you scale the elements against each other, the tiny logo next to the big product image, this is going to create that visual contrast that can help add drama to your piece. Context. This is where we scale elements relative to the surroundings that can communicate meaning. For this, the example is, say there's an oversized graphic element on the page in a minimalist layout. This is going to feel bold and modern. Unity and harmony. This is where we bring everything together. This is taking all those elements and all those principles, and we are going to make sure everything feels complete and cohesive. And unity and harmony are what, make a design feel like all of its parts belong together. It's going to create a sense of wholeness that is pleasing to the eye, and it communicates what it needs to communicate to the viewer. It's the overall consistency of a design, how well all the elements work together to support the message that you're trying to convey. Harmony, on the other hand, is just, about making sense of agreement among all the visual elements. Like, are the colors harmonized? I mean, we use the word color harmony. Are the shapes feeling like they go together? The textures, etc. But when they are together, they're going to make your design feel intentional and well thought out. Brand identities with consistent colors, fonts, logos, symbols. These are the ones that, achieve unity. It's instantly recognizable and it's super cohesive. And these are just some ones that I pulled out. The ones on the left are by Paula Scher. The ones on the right by Jessica Hish. We'll be talking about both of these later down the line. But again, all of these really easy to recognize, and we know them right off the bat. They work. That's how I would summarize unity. It works. And again, we're just bringing it all together. How do we get all of those elements, the shapes, the lines, the values, the colors, the contrast, the emphasis? How do we bring all of that together and let it work? More examples of this. Our contrast, our values, our tone shifts, our emphasis points, our repetitions. How do we bring it all together so that it all works? And again, how does it come together so that all works? Are the colors and fonts consistent? Are the shapes and the textures, do they complement each other? Is there a visual thread that ties everything together? The goal is to make every piece on the page feel like it belongs. So the takeaway with unity and harmony is this. Every design should feel like it has a clear purpose, and everything in it is working towards that purpose. When your design is unified and harmonious, it not only looks great, but it also is communicating effectively.